Welcome to Climate at Your Service, a Climate Europe 2 podcast where we delve into the world of climate services. I'm your host, Dr. Stacey, a climate scientist from the Met Office in the UK, and I'm thrilled to guide you through this exploration of how climate information can empower decision-making and action across different sectors and communities around the world. Today, we will introduce the Climate Europe 2 project, delve into what climate services are, and touch on what they aren't, and explore what standardisation is and why we need it in climate services. Joining me today is Dr. Asun St. Clair. Hello Asun, I hope you're well. Would you like to say hello to the listeners and say a little bit about yourself?
Hi Stacey, great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I have two hats in my career. I work as climate change lead in the Norske Veritas, or DNB, which is a risk management assurance provider worldwide in multiple industries. So that is corporate research. And at the same time, I'm also leading researcher at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center at a group called Knowledge Integration, which is part of the climate services team at the BSc.
Great. So I was actually reading about you. I wanted to get some bio in preparation for the podcast, and I read all about your various degrees. And I was just interested personally as to what you refer to yourself as, a sociologist, a philosopher, or maybe a socio-philosopher. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah, well, my background and my career has been very eclectic. I think that in terms of academic background, I think I will consider myself a philosopher of science and a sociologist of science and technology. But my identity is very mixed. I really consider myself to be somebody who wants to make sure that scientific knowledge of all sciences is put to work and is put to work in the right way. That's what moves me.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think all of us in Climate Europe too have that same kind of feeling around the work that we do. So we both work on Climate Europe 2, which has now been running since September 2022. It's gone very fast. I wondered if you could provide our listeners with a brief overview of the project, its objectives, and maybe talk a little bit about what your role is within the project.
Yes, great. So Climate Europe 2 is about climate services, and we will talk about in a minute, right, about what climate services are and what it means. But basically, the motivation of Climate Europe 2 is the realization of the community, both providers and users, and also the European Commission, that this is an unregulated field, that there is no governance mechanisms. So our mandate is to ensure that we can actually figure out what should be and could be a pathway to standardize climate services to ensure that eventually what we have is quality assured climate services. So this is one of the major objectives. At the same time, this means that the project is supporting and building the community of climate services, and to make sure that this community evolves in a manner that is equitable, which is a topic that I hope we can also talk more. And then through these two things, ensuring that we increase the uptake of climate services, because if we don't increase the uptake of climate services, then climate action is really not the way it should be.
Brilliant. So you mentioned when you started answering that question around climate services. So maybe we can clarify what we mean by climate services for our listeners who might be new to the concept, and to those who might already have an idea of what climate services are. In your own words, what do you see climate services are?
Well, actually, I mean, the first thing I guess we need to say is that climate services is a complicated concept, but it has a very clear definition, even though the boundaries are not so clear, and I will explain why that's the case. But basically, climate services is a term used to refer to the provision of climate information for decision-making. And the decision-making part is where the difficulties perhaps start, because here is we need to ensure that climate information facilitates decision-making for analyzing climate risks, for assessing options for adaptation to climate change impacts, or for mitigation strategies or net zero strategies, where we need to really be looking at how our policies are affecting the climate and be able to simulate the effect of those policies. So that is basically the definition of climate services. Now, in Climate Europe 2, what we have done in these 20 months since September 2022 has been to try to sort of unpack what this means in terms of ensuring that it includes engagement with users and providers, and also in terms of ensuring that the scientific basis of those climate services is actually credible and is legitimate.
Brilliant. So you've provided a very nice overview of what climate services are to the listeners, but I also think for me, it's important to cover what climate services aren't. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about this and perhaps clarify any misconceptions about climate services for our listeners. I think that would be very useful.
Yes, thank you, Stacey. I think this is very important. So I think one of the problems, and when I said that the concept of climate services has unclear boundaries, is because there is too many people and too many actors who confuse climate services with climate information. Whereas climate information is a necessary but not a sufficient condition in order to have a climate service. So if you let me unpack a little bit more into what are the types of things, or we call them climate services components, I will say there are four main elements that constitute the full service, moving the information, the climate information, into a particular decision. And the first is understanding of the decision context. So a climate service needs to be very aware of what is the decision in which the climate information needs to apply, needs to say something that is meaningful for users. It also includes a proper understanding of the wide ecosystem of actors and stakeholders that are going to have to be engaged in co-producing that climate information. It's a sort of dialogue between the provider and the user, and intermediaries that allow that conversation to flow in a proper way. Then we also need to understand that there is a large amount of different types of knowledge systems involved, in addition to legitimate and credible climate information. And that will be, for example, indigenous knowledge where applicable, or domain knowledge from industry, for example. And then lastly, the other fourth component of climate service refers to the delivery mode and to the evaluation of the service. We need to be able to ensure that the climate service is provided in a timely manner, that is accessible to users, and that there has to be some sort of feedback mechanism to evaluate how it has worked, what has not worked, etc. So again, what I will say to our listeners is, please do not confuse climate services with climate information, and use a very simple, sort of intuitive definition of the word service, right? What do we expect from service? Well, service always involves somebody giving something to somebody. So if you remove that part, you do have the climate information, but you don't have the service.
That's brilliant. Also, if you remove that part, I will no longer have a job as a climate services scientist. So thank you for keeping me employed. So I wonder if we can circle back maybe to standardisation, as this is a core part of the Climate Europe 2 project, and it's right in there in its objectives, best practice, standardisation. So I wonder if you could provide an explanation of what standardisation is, but in a simplified way. So maybe providing some examples of some standards we use in our everyday life, and then maybe go on to why standardization is important in climate services.
Very good. Yes, that's challenging, Stacey. But so I go back to the motivation of Climate Europe 2, saying climate services is an unregulated field. Now we need to take this carefully, because climate information is regulated. There is already quite a lot of standards about how the climate data should be structured and so on. Very good guidelines available by the World Meteorological Organization, by ECMWF and Copernicus, but that is only one little part. So what are standards? Standards are a form of governance. It is a form of governance and direct things and direct action in a particular way, very much in the way in which it is recognized by society towards a common good. So you want to govern something means that you want to move action, behavior, things into a particular direction that is acknowledged as leading towards a common good. And standards are everywhere. Think about where both you and I are sitting, right? It's like an invisible web standards. So in my building, and I'm sure in your building, whether you are at home or whether you are at the Met Office, there will be regulations that that building needs to meet, standards for the actual building and standards for the way in which, for example, the outlets for your laptop or the outlets for your mobile phone need to be. What is the shape? What is the size? All these are regulated through technical specifications and standards that builders follow. But at the same time, our buildings and our organizations are also managed through another type of standards, which is what is called procedural standards. And I'm sure that if you go somewhere around the Met Office, there will be one place in a hallway, or when you go to a hospital, you say, this hospital has been certified to follow management systems. So the organization is structured and functions in a particular way. So those particular ways are set up by existing standards. You may also find that there are efficiency standards, like, for example, energy efficiency. When you want to buy something today, at least certainly in Norway, the mortgage price is very dependent on the energy efficiency of the type of house that you are building. And the way in which you get that is by utilizing a series of efficiency standards that will tell you whether you are category A, to B, C, or D. So that's the sort of the type of standards that can be technical specifications, can be processes, or can be efficiency. There are many different ways to categorize standards. But if you think about, for example, when you go to the supermarket, and you go to the shelf and you choose your product, and behind your choices of the product is the assumption, and that is why you trust most of the time what it is being offered to you to buy on the shelf, that whatever you are buying follows food safety standards. And we do that without thinking. Think about that, right? Sometimes you may grab the can or the tin and turn it around, and you will say, oh, wait a second, I not only this is labeled following basic food standards, food safety standards, but it also is labeled as ecological. So that's another type of standard. So there will be a series of requirements that will tell you whether what you are buying follows the way in which ecological food products should be produced and should be transferred.
No, I was just going to say that was a brilliant answer. It's definitely helped my understanding of standards. But yeah, I just wonder if you could shed a little bit light on how kind of these standards contribute to the effectiveness of climate services. So why are we doing this, and why is it important for climate services?
So this is important for climate services because we want in the near future to be able to, if you are, let's say, a user, whether you are a company that wants to do a climate risk assessment, either for the purposes of reporting your climate risk or for the purposes of adapting your supply chain to potential climate impacts in the near future, and you want to go out there in what is a market, and you want to make sure that you are able to choose the right provider for your climate services. So how do you do that? Well, ideally, we want to make sure that there is a transparent offer of those climate services. And by that transparency, we mean that one can check whether the aspects that could be standardizable in climate services are actually being standardized. You want to make sure that in the same way that you purchase food that you believe follows food safety standards. You want to purchase climate services that follow standardization, guidelines, recommendations that eventually the community should produce. That's one part. That doesn't mean that all climate services are going to be purchased privately. There is a big part of it that is going to be the availability of data, which it is partially, as I said, standardized. But we also want to make sure that there is a set of rules that follow how that data should be harvested, even if it is for public use. You see what I mean? So it's on the one hand to make sure that we have a transparent market, like we demand for absolutely everything else, any kind of product, any kind of service. On the other hand, like we also demand for everything else, we want to make sure that the information provision and the information harvesting from public data follow a set of existing regulations to ensure that that data is being harvested and is being used in an appropriate way.
So that's really interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we ensure that everyone has equal access to these standards. So equitable climate services, I know that's a big part of our project as well. So I wonder if you could just touch on that a little bit.
Absolutely. This is crucial. I think it's crucial in Climate Europe too, but it should be crucial at all levels. And so the risk of standardization is important, but there is always some risk. And so one of it will be, let's say, imagine a near future where we have managed to standardize, but we have standardized too much, meaning the benchmark is too high. And by definition, this means that only actors and providers that are well-resourced will be able to meet those standards. So I think we need to be very careful not to put that benchmark too high. So I don't particularly like the language of high quality. What we want is a minimum benchmark. At the same time, we also want to make sure that the standardization process is equitable. And that means that as standards organizations initiate this process, it is of fundamental importance that sitting at the table are all voices that are going to be able to see the standardization of climate services from the perspective of vulnerable communities. We are set in the set of Europe, the setting of Europe in Climate Europe too, but we need to think globally as well, right? So we need to be able to ensure that the standardization outcome is equitable, meaning doesn't set the benchmark too high, and that the standardization process is equitable in the sense that it gives voice to all sorts of participants. Those are, I think, to me, very important. In fact, I will go beyond that. As I said earlier, if climate services are not climate information, I think one of the most important things going into the future is going to have to be the recognition that we need a democratic process, participatory process around the further work on making sure that climate services are available to everyone. I will say in a democratic way, the deliberative democracy. We really need to open up this field. It needs to be science-based, but it cannot be science rule.
Perfect. That's neatly brings us on to the end of the podcast. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to say to the listeners, anything we've missed.
Yes, I think I want to add 2 or 3 more points. So the first actually relates to the equitability, but also to how I will envision going forward. And that is related to the importance of ensuring that this standardization process also leads us to the possibility of scaling up products. So because we say we want engagements, we want tailoring the scientific information for decision making, but if you have to repeat these processes again and again and again, right, it will be extremely costly. While we want to make sure that the data and the services also are available. So I think we need to reach a fine balance between making things scalable and replicable, where I will expect standards to help, and at the same time, making sure that this is not working against accessibility. We want to make sure that we have an open market, a transparent market, where consultancies, which are many in Europe who sell climate services today, are transparent as to what their service does and doesn't do, and where you have an open competition, because an open competition field is always much better. You want an open competition, and that means also not hiding that maybe another provider might be better for you. And then on the other hand, we want to make sure that this is not taken up by a privatization. So the standardization of climate services should not lead to a privatization of all this or marketization of climate information, because that will lead to huge injustices. So it's finding this right balance that seems to me, it goes beyond Climate Europe 2, but it seems to me where we also want to make sure that regulatory forces at the European and at the national level come into play to ensure the availability of data, but also to ensure the saliency, credibility, and legitimacy of that data. So that is one key point. The other, I will say, is that we need a massive capacity building effort. We need capacity building in multiple ways. We need to be able to ensure that users are able to have a dialogue with those intermediaries or with those scientists to make sure that they are able to understand what they need and what they don't need. And at the same time, we need to ensure a massive capacity building of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary skills within the research community of climate services, which I'm sorry to say, I love climate scientists. I have many friends that are climate scientists, but they need to be able to listen to the community that has worked on adaptation solutions, the community that is on the ground in cities, in small towns, working with marginalized groups who understand the difficulties of and the difficulties on the one hand, and also the big differences in perceiving risks and in real risks that there are. Yeah? So a climate hazard that can be perfectly, let's say, predictable, right? Let's say all the models are perfect, which is not the case, but we do have a lot more predictability in terms of climate hazards. But what those climate hazards mean for different communities is a completely different ballgame. And in order to understand, and that is where your understanding the decision-making context comes in, we need to really join forces with the adaptation community in the adaptation, and we need to join forces with the enormous amount of activity that is happening all over in private and public organizations regarding mitigation efforts. How does the use of climate services helps guiding the way in which you assess the impact of a particular policy for mitigating or the impact of a particular net zero strategy? We are very far away yet to really have the right conversation in the relationship between climate services and mitigation. And I think that is another arena where I will say the future of climate services lie.
I totally agree with all of that. As a physical scientist who's now moved into climate services, that more kind of social field, I definitely agree with everything you're saying around that. So yeah, a fantastic answer. So thank you, Asun, for joining us today and providing valuable insights into the Climate Europe 2 project and the important role that climate services play in guiding our decisions for a better future. And thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in to this introductory episode of the Climate Europe 2 podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes where we'll delve deeper into the world of climate services, and please don't hesitate to get involved. Send us your questions, tell us which topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, send us a message on social media. X and LinkedIn links can be found in the podcast description, or email us at info climateeurope2@bsc.es. That's info climateeurope2@bsc.es. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions on climate services.